Hi, and welcome to Viewmaster Travels. Today I'm digging into the history of a single building, Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., as I continue visiting locations featured in vintage Viewmaster reels. This one's a 3-reel souvenir pack, probably sold at the theater gift shop in 1970. The theater's been the site of dramatic performances and dark tragedies. Not just the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but 22 other people were killed there. And here's a twist. Almost everything we see there today is fake. But before we look for our first Viewmaster picture, a little history. John Thompson Ford was born in 1829 in Baltimore. By age 25, he was managing both the Holiday Street Theater in Baltimore and the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. He wanted to expand into the nation's capital and eventually found a Baptist church for lease in D.C. on 10th Street. The church leaders warned Ford there'd be a dire fate for anyone converting a place of worship into a place of entertainment, but Ford signed his lease anyway. The building was here, marked on this 1836 map as a church, just a few blocks from the president's house and the Capitol. Ford converted the building into a theater and called it the Athenaeum. It was a hit. President Lincoln even saw a musical concert starring Clara Louise Kellogg in this theater in 1862. But the next year, a faulty gas meter caused a fire and burned the entire building to the ground. Ford hired builder James J. Gifford to design and build a new theater on the site. Let's take a look. It's the first Viewmaster picture we're trying to find. West facade, Ford's Theater on 10th Street. Ford had the support of the most influential D.C. politicians and business people, and at a cost of $75,000, Ford's new theater opened just 6 months later, and seems to stand today unchanged. It was a great success for Ford, and Lincoln saw 8 additional shows there over the next 2 years. Back then, you'd have entered through one of these 5 doorways in the front, depending what kind of ticket you had. Today, we entered through a modern lobby in a connected building next door. The building to the north has changed use a lot over the years. A dye shop, a laundry, a TV store, a camera shop, and eventually a souvenir shop, probably where the Viewmaster packets were sold. But it was purchased by the Park Service in 1974 to become part of the modern entrance to the theater. We bought our tickets and went through the new lobby into the original theater lobby and then downstairs to the theater's basement museum to learn what had happened on April 14th in 1865. For Good Friday, Ford was hosting British actress Laura Keane's popular variety troupe at his theater, with the last show of a 2-week engagement, a benefit performance of one of her most popular plays, Our American Cousin. At the last minute, President Lincoln had agreed to Ford's invitation to attend the performance, causing Ford to gladly reprint his playbills, advertising Lincoln's attendance. The theater staff decorated the presidential box with special furniture, flags, and a picture of George Washington, and Lincoln did arrive as promised. But as we all know, an assassin was literally waiting in the wings and snuck into the president's box, shooting the president and leaping down to the stage to escape via the back door. The path of American history forever changed course that day as President Lincoln passed away in the boarding house across the street. The next Viewmaster picture we were looking for was the actual scene of the crime, or was it? Looking across the stage to the presidential box. It's a somber experience to explore the theater, sitting in the actual seats used by people that saw one of the most tragic and influential moments in U.S. history, except we weren't. I remember thinking at the time, is this the actual stage Booth landed on? Is that the actual chair Lincoln was sitting in? Turns out, no, they're not. Immediately after the assassination, the theater was locked down. Armed guards were stationed outside since it was a crime scene. Even so, looters were already sneaking souvenirs away. Photographer Matthew Brady was brought in to photograph the scene, documentation which would become crucial almost 100 years later. The theater remained locked down until the conspiracy trial concluded, at which point Ford tried to reopen his theater with Octoroon, the play he'd meant to do the day after Our American Cousin, selling 200 tickets. There was quite the public outcry at this, though. Ford even received an anonymous letter threatening to burn the theater down if it ever reopened. On opening night, though, ticket holders found a sign, closed by order of the Secretary of War. They all got full refunds. Realizing the futility of reopening, Ford sold the theater to the government for $88,000, plus the $12,000 in rent he'd received during the trial, and went back to Baltimore. Perhaps trying to erase the memory of this tragic event, the government entirely demolished the inside of the theater by the end of the year, leaving just the building's outer shell, and converted it into a large warehouse. So no, what we were seeing as we wandered the theater was not original. Everything original had been removed or destroyed. I'm sure Ford often thought back to that portentous omen given him by the Baptist Church. But another tragedy was yet to come. The balcony and presidential box at left of the stage. You have no way of realizing, exploring the theater today, how different the building was for most of its life. In 1866, the Army Medical Museum moved onto the third floor, displaying all kinds of gruesome surgery exhibits, including, ironically, part of John Wilkes Booth's spine, with Boston Corbett's bullet still lodged within it. The first two floors were taken over by the Office of Records and Pensions, who sorted through Civil War veterans' pension claims. They expanded to the entire building by 1887, eventually employing 500 people there. On June 9, 1893, tragedy struck Ford's old theater once again. Basement remodeling work destabilized one of the columns supporting the upper floors, and the third floor collapsed onto the floor below, which couldn't bear the weight and collapsed to the ground and into the basement. 22 people were killed, in a way the final victims of the Civil War. They died where Lincoln had died. Public outcry was immediate as the scale of the tragedy came to light, and opinion was divided as to what should be done with the building. Lincoln's murder was still a painful memory, and many people felt the building should be entirely demolished. However, by the end of the year, it was repaired and turned into a government publications warehouse. It remained this way well into the 20th century. In 1931, the building transferred to the Office of Public Buildings and Public Parks, run by Ulysses S. Grant III, whose grandfather almost attended the play with Lincoln. Grant Jr. had just purchased the largest private collection of Lincoln memorabilia from Osborne Oldroyd, who'd been running a museum in the Peterson House across the street where Lincoln had actually died. This purchase refreshed interest in creating some kind of Lincoln Museum in the old theater building, and on what would have been Lincoln's 123rd birthday, the building opened to the public once again. The derringer with which Booth killed Lincoln. The museum today is in the basement of the theater building, and most of Oldroyd's original collection is in a modern building connected to the Peterson House across the street. In 1932, though, the museum was on the first floor of the warehouse that the theater had become. It was a sterile collection of documents and letters in glass cases. It didn't give any kind of sense of what had happened in that location. The outline of the president's box was drawn on the floor, and Booth's footprints were marked, leading to the back door. However, many of the key artifacts you can see today, like Booth's derringer, weren't included, as it was felt it would have been in bad taste. By the 50s, attendance at the Lincoln Museum had fallen to only a third of what it was when it opened. Many visitors were disappointed to find that the interior of the theater was a warehouse. The Evening Star summed it up. It's a museum now, and it contains a model of the theater about the size of a packing case. A recorded voice tells the story. That's not much of a show for children in this TV age. Over the years, there were several debates about rebuilding Ford's theater, but it was considered an impossible task since all of James Gifford's original plans had been lost. Finally, in 1960, with the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination approaching, Congress agreed to look into what it would take to restore the theater. At this point, I think I need to emphasize the difficulty of this project. They intended to rebuild Ford's theater entirely accurately, exactly as it was in 1865, but they had nothing to go by. No blueprints, no original plans, just a big empty building. It wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for one man, George J. Olszewski, who had a genius for uncovering historical evidence. He spent the next 3 years putting together the Historic Structures Report on the restoration of Ford's theater. He and his team discovered the long-lost Matthew Brady crime scene photographs in the back room of Springfield State Library, and unearthed previously unknown photographs from a small museum in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They analyzed these photographs as well as evidence from the original trial and eyewitness accounts and put together designs for every detail of the theater construction, from the floor plan to decorations, furnishings, signage, and even the sidewalk street lamps. The museum closed at the end of 1964 and construction began in January of '65, taking 3 years and costing $2 million. The restored theater opened on January 30th, 1968 with a gala, televised on CBS, that opened with Helen Hayes reading part of Our American Cousin while a spotlight shone on the empty president's box. After 103 years, Ford's wish for his old theater to reopen finally came true.
You know, it was 100 years ago, great tragedy took place in that box. And then for 100 years, this theater was dark and silent. And now it was open, it was filled with creative life, performance, art. And I think that the victim of that tragedy, I think he would have preferred it the way it is now, alive again, and filled with what we've seen here tonight.
When we visited Ford's theater, we weren't aware that we weren't seeing the actual original structure. We weren't sitting in the actual chairs or even climbing the original stairs. The stage and balconies were modern constructions. It was a moving experience to be in that location, and I'm really glad we got to see an actual theater and not just a stark museum. But I feel our experience really was a simulation of history, not history itself. Is that a problem though? I'm not sure. But that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching.